This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on making government work, my guest is former commissioner with the Maryland Public Service Commission, Ann Hoskins. She's currently Senior Vice President for Energy Technology Policy and Market Development with Generac Power Systems and a member of California's Central Coast Water Quality Control Board. Ann's going to describe how government policies supporting clean energy have, in many cases, fulfilled the founding generation's goal of a government that would create a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity. In addition to Ann's work on Maryland's commission, her government experience includes time as policy advisor to the New Jersey Governor's Office of Policy and Planning and attorney to the U.S. Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. In the private sector, she's been with Verizon, Verizon Wireless, New Jersey Electric Utility PSEG, and she was Chief Policy Officer for Sunrun before taking on her current work with Generac and the Water Quality Control Board. So, Ann, think about your experience in government and the private sector. Give us, our listeners, an overview of maybe what kind of overarching lesson you got about the importance of effective government.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts after quite a long career that you've just laid out for the folks. When I look back at it all, one of the key drivers, I think, to some of the successful policies we've seen has been the engagement at the state level. Over time, many people get very excited about federal policy, and there have been very important federal policies, and I'll touch on an important role the federal government has played. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at trying to encourage a change in our energy system, so much of that happens at the state level, at state regulatory commissions, through state legislatures, through governor's offices. And so through the various roles that I've had, it's always been important to make sure we engage at the state level. So I'm really excited to bring a little more attention to that. Sometimes states are kind of not considered the main actors, but we're definitely seeing today the critical role that states play in making sure we have effective government.
Absolutely. And that's really what I want to get into here. So let's get very specific, Ann. Uh, the purpose of this series of podcasts is to highlight examples of when, where, how, and why government worked. Now, you suggested one way that we could talk about that is in the development and implementation of the Solar App Plus, which automated rooftop solar permit processing and permit reform to make processing more efficient is a really big topic these days. So let's take up this issue with the Solar App Plus. What was it? What was the problem that it had tried to address? What was the solution and how was it executed? And as you talk, tell us how government was so critical in the outcome for that.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk about Solar App. I became quite involved with Solar App around 2019 when I was leading the policy team at Sunrun. And Sunrun had now taken on battery installation in addition to residential solar. And it was really important that we could find a way to reduce some of what we called the soft costs, some of the delays in installations, and just the complication that you would have a different permitting requirements in different municipalities across the country. And so
And could I that app was developed, wasn't it developed by the Department of Energy?
yes, I'll explain the history here. So at the time, there were efforts going on within the industry to try to figure out how we could all work together to automate and find a solution. And the Department of Energy, through what was then called NREL, the National Renewable Lab, Energy Renewable Lab, now the Renewable Lab of the Rockies, played a critical role because DOE, through the CETO office, funded the national lab to try to determine how to automate a system for permitting, but they couldn't do it alone. They had to work with the industry to find out what the problems were, what the process was. And so it was very much a collaboration between industry, the local permitting officials, the national lab. And it started out as solar, and then we expanded it to include batteries as well. The reason that this is such a good example is yes, we had the federal funding and the work of the experts at the national labs, but then we also had the industry participate, sharing their expertise, the local officials sharing theirs. And then once it kicked off, we went to another phase. We thought, okay, well, now how are we going to get this implemented across all these municipalities across the country? And we created an advocacy organization among representatives of companies and nonprofits. And then there were technical groups that continued to work with NREL. And what we did in California, which was the first state to really step up to try to take hold of this and get it out into municipalities, is we were able to achieve legislation that required municipalities to have some type of automation. And then importantly, state incentives to give municipalities some funding, because for them to take on automation was going to cost money. Even if it was going to save them money in the long term, they needed some incentive. So you had this perfect example in my mind of one, recognizing different roles for different levels of government, but also engaging, the private sector, the nonprofit sector in different ways in which we could build support for this idea and also support continued development of the technology.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
The federal agency conceptualized a way of streamlining permitting, but it then went down to the state level, and state legislators developed legislation that would enact it, right? That's what you're saying.
Well,
And then you had to have municipal level activity. You had to have these permitting offices in each community or in various communities enact what was proposed by the federal agency and legislated by the state representatives, right?
in California, yes. Now, the other exciting part about this is that we then started to see it spread in other parts of the country. I think there were maybe 19 states or so by 2024 that had adopted some form of automated permitting, not always exactly the solar app. I mean, the solar app took a lot of work to really identify everything a permitting official might want to see and make it so that essentially solar installers could self-certify if they met all those criteria. And so it was really interesting in terms of, really putting something out there that the permitting officials could feel comfortable with. But since that came out, and now we're starting to see some other private sector proposals. We're seeing, other ways. I think New York is creating more of a standards approach, and that's fine. But what was important here is you had an example where you had the federal government, which had the resources to kick this off. They were open to engagement from the private sector. And then you had a state, in that case, California, who embraced it and tried to put both a carrot and a stick out there, saying, municipalities, you need to do something automated, but here, if you want to try to do this one, this solar app, we can give you some money to institute it. So, the reason that I suggested this example is because I think that if you want policy initiatives to continue on after administrations, right? Whether at the state level or at the federal level, you really need to make sure that there's buy-in from other parties. One of the other organizations actually that I'm involved in on the board of is IREC, right? Which is a really important nonprofit that works on permitting and on interconnection. That was an example where IREC also participated in this. So we had nonprofits as well as private sector organizations joining that new board called Solar App Board to make sure that it will continue. And, an important part of this is that in 2024, it transitioned from the lab to now a nonprofit organization, standalone organization that will continue regardless of political changes. Obviously, we're all going to have to work to make sure they get funding from philanthropic sources and other sources, but it's now no longer completely dependent on federal authorities.
I can't remember what the I in IREC stands for. I know that it's Renewable Energy Council. Do you remember?
Interstate.
Interstate. That's
Interstate
it.
Renewable
Interstate.
Energy Council. It's
Yeah.
not really a council, but it's a group of, independent experts really that participate in state regulatory proceedings. They support workforce development and they support local initiatives. And the local initiative is permitting reform.
Right.
So again, when you are going to pass a state policy or state regulation, and it's up to local municipalities to, you know, implement that, it's very helpful to have third parties, as much as, I'm in the private sector, and a company that I might work with may say they like something. It really helps to have third parties that are independent to also work with those organizations. So what was, very helpful in this whole process is it wasn't just IREC, there were others and there were permitting officials that participated. So I think it gave really the government officials, the private parties, confidence that they'd come up with something that really would work and really would, promote the public interest, which was very important when you were, having government support, that you had that eye on promoting the public interest.
And we might as well say that another role for federal and state governments is the funding that they make available to organizations like IREC that allow them to do the work. And that is, again, complemented, as you pointed out, by private sector funding. But let's move on to the other example you suggested we talk about. You described to me in emails the jurisdiction by jurisdiction policy development that led to the recognition of the value of virtual power plants, which are now becoming a real force in the power system. And I think you said it started with New England's connected solutions. So connect the dots again, the problem faced, the solution, how it was executed, and how government was so critical in developing that.
Certainly, it's very exciting today to see all of the excitement around virtual power plants. It's been something that people working in distributed resources and clean energy have been thinking about and working on, for almost a decade. Certainly, before that, when you look at what was called traditionally demand response, when you had smart thermostats, other types of demand response, but when batteries came to play in a significant way, I'd say around 2017, 2018, there really was a lot of work to think about how can we take this resource and put it to use, right, to, reduce costs, potentially participate in competitive markets, but actually share that power when it was needed. And the first state that I think really embraced that in a significant way was Massachusetts through what we call the Connected Solutions Program. I mean, certainly there were other efforts in other states, but in that case, it really worked to, basically allow companies through a private sector approach to, sell or lease their solar and battery systems to customers. And then those customers could participate in a utility program, get compensated for it, and provide benefit to the entire community, right, of ratepayers. So this was very exciting. And why I think it's an interesting model is that it then spread throughout New England, partly because their utilities are cross-jurisdictional, but it did spread in different ways. And this was around, I'd say, 2019 through 2021 or so. And then we started to see a number of other proposals coming up. And another one that is not exactly similar, but was certainly also playing a big role is the DSGS program in California. Now that
SGS is a distributed solar.
no,
uh,
sorry, it was demand side grid support. And it grew out of a different problem. It grew out of a concern for the need for emergency response, basically, after, we had, and I'm in California. So after we had uh, risks of blackouts in early 2020s and a concern of how are we going to meet emergencies. And so this was actually a state-funded approach, not a utility-funded approach, that after about two years of a lot of work from a lot of stakeholders, created a program that essentially would compensate batteries, thermostats, EV chargers, etc., to be available and participate in emergency situations. And again, it was through aggregation. So we were starting to see a state has a problem, whether it's demand response and they're just trying to come up with new sources of capacity or energy, or emergency resiliency, and they were looking at distributed resources as a solution. And now what we've seen in this last year, especially, is proposals all over the country. New Jersey, Virginia, with energy as critical political issues and the recent campaigns, both of those states have proposed virtual power plant proposals. We also saw legislation pass in Illinois. These all have some differences, and I think that's okay. My view on this is that if you have some states that are able to take leadership on these types, have the resources, have the staff, there's a pretty big variation in staff resources in utility commissions, even in governor's offices and state agencies. You have those resources and can start a program and demonstrate its effectiveness. It can then become a really important example that can be used in advocacy in other states. And I think that that's what's happening now. As New Jersey just had an RFI, request for information, on their VPP proposal, and I am certain that the Connected Solutions program was mentioned multiple times in the filings. The same thing happened when we were working on the demand side grid support program in California. We were able to point to, look at the success from Massachusetts, look at the success of aggregating resources. Herman, there were a lot of folks who are questioning, will distributed resources show up? And the answer is yes,
That's
they
the
do.
classic question that utilities
Right.
always ask and have always asked as demand response has sort of evolved into virtual power plants. The lingering question, would they show up? In California, Connected Solutions demonstrated it early on, but that DSGS program, 500 megawatts during the trial, that first big trial last year or 2 years ago. Was it last year or 2 years ago? I can't remember.
There was a lot of information on last year's. So, yeah, I mean, I think that having different states take different approaches. I mean, yes, I guess if there was one approach that worked, the silver bullet, maybe you would see that. But the truth is, you've got across the country, we have different regulatory. That's one of the challenges in the U.S., right? We have so many. We have 50 states. We have the different ISOs and RTOs. You've got vertically integrated or restructured, and so that's why states are such an interesting and powerful tool here, because you can try something out, have it work in your, environment, and then others can look at their structure, look what other programs they already have, look at their tax incentives, et cetera, and they can adapt it for their situation. It's
Let me
not going
ask
to
you,
give you, I'm sorry,
go
that
ahead. No,
that
finish your thought.
one, again, silver bullet that you might get with a federal program. Federal tax credits, we could do a whole nother episode on
Yeah,
that, have been
absolutely.
critical and available across the country. But I don't think they've been sufficient to achieve all of the public interest and public policy goals that we want to achieve. And I think you bring that home by engagement at this more state and local level.
First of all, let me mention to our listeners that we had Sachu Constantine, who's the executive director of a very wonderful, powerful advocacy group called Vote Solar, on the podcast, and he described the strengths and weaknesses of the proposals to change California's DSGS program. And on that topic, Ann, I want to ask you, some people have said to me that the changes that need to take place on this very successful virtual power plant support program in California uh, are to shift the funding from the public sphere to the utilities, which I think you mentioned is how the Connected Solutions programs are funded through the utilities. So I wonder, first of all, great example of trying out two different styles of funding, which just goes to the point you're making very well. But I wonder if you've come down on one or the other being a better idea, utility funding
Yeah.
versus public funding.
Uh, you know, I don't think there's one answer to that. I think one of the bigger questions right now is how we can engage these programs in the wholesale markets. Particularly if you're looking at a market like PJM that has these very, high capacity costs and urgent needs. One of the exciting things about Connected Solutions is that that program was set up that you could bid into New England ISO as well as participate, recognizing there were different values if you had storage than just the retail value of providing energy. And so, that to me is a way that the bigger issue and opportunity for us right now. I mean, we're certainly seeing, another example of interesting opportunities right now that are different, but same utility, XL, XL Minnesota just approved where they're going to be able to own batteries that are going to put out on the in front of the meter, jargon language, I guess, but out in the system and control those. That's a type of virtual power plant, I would say. Whereas their sister utility in Colorado is going to do a more competitive approach, also engaging utilities. But I think that, right now, my view is we should be looking at multiple options to see the best way that we can um, encourage companies to make these investments and encourage customers to participate. And sometimes utilities, have not been as cost effective, and it really depends on looking, state by state and what the incentives are and what's going to work and how they're best going to be able to engage with CAISO, CAISO, or ERCOT, et cetera.
And there are many ways, many different ways to promote the general welfare. I want to ask you. Oh, and by the way, listeners, one of the first important news reports about that Minnesota program was written by yours truly, and you can find it at Utility Dive on the deep dive page. But the last question, Ann, we're running a little short of time. I want to ask you what the key levers of change that you saw in your time in government, in your time in the private sector, in your time in the energy sector, uh, levers that could expand our experience of a government that serves its citizens. And I want to get to one before you answer that question, Ann. You were on the Maryland Commission. Was it, like so many other commissions, overworked and underfunded and understaffed? And isn't a good commission one of the key levers of change?
Yes, a good commission is a key lever of change. I don't necessarily mean to imply, though, that the biggest commissions are that much more effective. But I will say that given the complexity of the issues and the opportunities right now, that it is really important that commissioners have resources to, have advisors, to make sure that the staff is well compensated to answer these really important, do the research on these important issues. And there is a great variation across the country in the types of resources that states put towards this. So I absolutely agree that this should be a priority. I know that there have been efforts in the past, anyway, where the Federal Department of Energy had funded to have some staff experts basically shared with state commissions. I think that's a really interesting idea. I also know organizations like RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, when just as I was leaving the commission, we had just had some very big orders issued. And my recommendation to the commission was you should work with RAP. You need to get some more technical expertise. These are former commissioners and these folks have a lot of experience. So I think that's another model. It goes to what you were also implying or saying earlier, which is we really need to find a way to fund some of these third-party organizations. One of my biggest concerns when I left the Maryland Commission, and one of the reasons I decided to go work for Sunrun, is that when we had a few major rate cases and a major merger proceeding, there really was not enough engagement from third parties, even third party companies, because it's hard, right? I mean, you've got 50 state commissions. None of the competitive companies can afford. I have a very, very small staff at Generac. They're amazing, but we're very small, as are the other, my other colleagues in other companies, versus utilities that will have groups of, 100 or more regulatory staff for a single state. And so when you're in that situation, it makes it very challenging. And it's really important that you can have other voices. You're not going to expect philanthropy to support companies. We have to make those decisions ourselves. But if you don't have other voices and other technical experts who can come in and challenge the interconnection proposals from utilities, or whether you need I remember gas pipeline discussions, and there would be no one there to really question whether or not the ones that were being chosen, except a couple of staff people. But it's hard when you have a litigated proceeding and you don't have folks. So that's really, really important if we're going to rely on states, which I think states have an important role, is that we recognize it's kind of it is an uneven playing field. So when I left, I thought I'm going to go join the other side of the playing field. I really want to make sure that all of these issues are being vetted. And obviously the utilities have amazing expertise and very important role to play in all of this, but you need to have other voices. Now, for the rest of, the other thoughts I had as I was looking through this is, when I started out in state government, in the governor's office in New Jersey, it was in the late 80s. And that's when we were talking about laboratories of democracy being from the states. I worked for Governor Tom Kean, and it was such an exciting time because there was a lot of freedom to really think about what we could do. I actually worked on some of the early PJM work for New Jersey back then. And that's really what I continue to think we should be focusing on is, how can we work with state regulators, state policymakers, bring our expertise to bear, give them the resources they want so they really can be the test labs, at this time with so much need for new solutions that can deal with the affordability and the reliability challenges that we have. So, that's my sense. Obviously, the federal government plays a critical role here. We engage with them at Generac. As I said, the state tax credits were, foundational for what we've seen in a lot of the development, but they're not enough. So that's my pitch. Let's all get out there, engage with the states, and help them as they work to tackle these difficult problems.
That's a great place to leave it. I just want to add that the state commissions are a branch of government. The local community level agencies, another branch of government, and giving people the opportunity to produce quality results like you've described with Solar App and with these various policies that are driving virtual power plants. Both examples of giving those folks the support to do quality work. But that's all the time we have, Ann. I'm going to end it there. I want to thank you. My guest has been Ann Hoskins, former Maryland Utility Commissioner and currently Generac Power Systems Senior Vice President for Energy Technology Policy and Market Development. And she's also a member of the board of the California Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. And she's described examples of how government can be an effective ally in promoting the common defense, providing the general welfare, and so forth and so on. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.